Texas, 1875. The scorched earth of West Texas seemed no place for hope to take root. Dust devils danced across barren plains as 25-year-old Xavier Raines adjusted the worn leather of his holster, squinting against the relentless sun. A lifetime of harsh lessons had taught him that attachments were dangerous, a luxury the frontier didn't permit. His father's dying words still echoed in his mind. "Trust no one out here, son. The West takes more than it gives." Xavier had built his reputation as one of the fastest guns in Maverick County, not because he craved violence, but because he understood its necessity. His skill kept him alive and employed, escorting stagecoaches and hunting bounties when ranch work dried up. The lone wolf existence suited him. No family to lose, no heart to break. Just survival, day after day. From his vantage point atop a rocky outcrop, Xavier spotted the approaching dust cloud of what appeared to be a small wagon. Curious, he guided his Palomino, Thunder, down the hillside. Something wasn't right. The wagon moved erratically, too fast for safety on the rutted trail. As he drew closer, Xavier saw the problem immediately. A woman fought desperately with the reins, her face etched with terror as her horses bolted wildly. Behind her, smoke billowed from the wagon bed, flames licking at the canvas cover. Without hesitation, Xavier spurred Thunder alongside the runaway wagon. In a fluid motion born from years of practice, he leaped from his saddle onto the bench seat beside the terrified woman. "Let go," he commanded, wresting the reins from her trembling hands. The horses, frantic with fear, resisted his pull, but Xavier's strength gradually prevailed. As the wagon slowed, the woman's desperate sobs penetrated his focus. "My son, please, my son isn't back." Xavier's blood ran cold. Securing the reins, he turned to see flames devouring the wagon's cover. Without thought for his own safety, he dove into the inferno. Heat seared his lungs as smoke blinded him. Frantically, his hands searched through blankets and supplies until they found something solid, a small, motionless body. Clutching the child to his chest, Xavier burst from the flames, rolling onto the ground to extinguish the fire catching at his shirt. The boy wasn't breathing. Xavier worked with desperate efficiency, turning the child onto his stomach and applying firm pressure between his shoulder blades. Seconds stretched into eternity until finally, the boy coughed, expelling soot and drawing a ragged breath. The woman fell to her knees beside them, gathering her son into her arms with a cry of relief that pierced straight through Xavier's carefully constructed walls. As the boy's breathing steadied, she looked up, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. "I'm Ruby Calloway," she whispered, "and you just saved everything that matters to me." In that moment, as Xavier gazed into Ruby's sapphire blue eyes framed by honey-blonde hair escaping from a practical bun, something shifted in his world, a dangerous crack in his belief that the frontier permitted no tenderness. 2 days later, Xavier led Ruby and her 4-year-old son, Tommy, into Cottonwood Springs. Ruby sat tall in her saddle despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. Her simple blue dress, scorched at the hem, couldn't diminish the quiet dignity in her bearing. At 22, she carried herself with the resolve of someone who had already weathered more than her share of storms. "My sister runs the boarding house," Ruby explained as they rode down the dusty main street. "I was heading to join her after." She trailed off, glancing protectively at Tommy, who rode before Xavier on Thunder. Xavier nodded, understanding her reluctance to speak openly of whatever had driven her to travel alone with a child across dangerous territory. Everyone on the frontier had stories they preferred to keep buried. The boarding house proved to be a well-maintained 2-story building at the edge of town. A slender woman with the same honey-blonde hair as Ruby rushed from the porch, her hands flying to her mouth when she spotted them. "Ruby, thank God. When you didn't arrive yesterday, I feared." Her eyes darted to Xavier, suspicion immediately replacing relief. "This is Xavier Raines," Ruby said quickly. "He saved Tommy from our burning wagon." Something in Xavier wanted to ride away now that Ruby had reached safety. The gratitude in her eyes made him uncomfortable. He wasn't accustomed to being looked at with anything other than wariness or calculation. Yet when Ruby's sister Margaret insisted he stay for supper, Xavier found himself accepting. That night, as he sat at their table, watching Tommy's animated retelling of the rescue, he experienced something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. You'll need work now, Xavier said to Ruby as they stood on the porch after supper. Your wagon, your supplies. Ruby's expression hardened with determination. I'll manage. I always have. I know the foreman at the Crescent Ranch, Xavier offered, surprising himself. They need a cook for the summer drive. And Tommy. Ranchers understand family obligations. The lie came easily. Xavier knew most outfits wouldn't welcome a woman with a child, but something made him want to smooth her path. I'll speak to Jim Wallace tomorrow. Ruby studied him, her blue eyes searching. Why would you do that for us? Xavier had no answer that made sense, even to himself. He tipped his hat and descended the porch steps, uncomfortable with the question and the unfamiliar pull he felt toward this woman and her son. You don't have to keep saving us, Ruby called after him. Xavier paused without turning back. Get some rest, Mrs. Calloway. Miss, she corrected. It's Miss Calloway now. Her words followed Xavier into the night, along with the unsettling realization that for the first time in years, he was considering someone else's future alongside his own. Spring roundup at Crescent Ranch brought Xavier back to Cottonwood Springs a month later. He'd secured Ruby a position as the cook's assistant, and though the arrangement wasn't ideal, it allowed her to keep Tommy with her. What Xavier hadn't expected was how often his thoughts had drifted to Ruby during his absence. He found her behind the ranch house, struggling with a mountain of dirty dishes. The warmth in her smile when she spotted him stirred something dangerous within him. The famous Xavier Raines returns, she teased, wiping her hands on her apron. Tommy's been telling everyone who'll listen about how you pulled him from the fire. The boy exaggerates, Xavier replied, uncomfortable with praise. No, Ruby said softly. He doesn't. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. Xavier would bring fresh game for the cook pot. Ruby would save him extra biscuits. He found excuses to linger around the chuck wagon, and she seemed in no hurry to shoo him away. Tommy attached himself to Xavier like a shadow whenever possible, peppering him with questions about horses, guns, and the adventures of a cowboy's life. One evening, Xavier found Ruby alone by the creek, washing clothes in the fading light. Her honey-blonde hair hung loose around her shoulders, catching the gold of sunset. When she looked up, her face still held the weariness of hard work, but there was something else, a quiet strength that drew him closer. Tommy finally asleep? He asked, squatting beside her. She nodded. Out like a light. All that following you around wears him out. Xavier picked up a shirt, awkwardly helping her wring it out. You don't mind? Him trailing after me? He needs a man to look up to, Ruby said, then quickly added. Not that I'm suggesting, I understand. Xavier stared at the water, gathering courage. Ruby, what happened to your husband? Her hand stilled. What makes you think I was married? Tommy has your eyes, but his face. Xavier hesitated. He favors someone else. Ruby was silent for so long that Xavier thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the creek's gentle flow. His name was Daniel. We weren't married. He promised we would be, but... Her gaze remained fixed on the rippling water. When I told him about the baby, he disappeared. Came back a year later with a wife from back east. Anger flared in Xavier's chest. And now? Why were you traveling alone? Daniel died in a mining accident. His widow blamed me, said I brought bad luck. Ruby's chin lifted with pride that belied the hurt in her eyes. The town took her side. It was time to leave. Xavier reached for her hand, surprising both of them. Their loss, he said simply. Ruby's fingers tightened around his, and something passed between them, unspoken but powerful. Later, Xavier would mark this as the moment he began to question everything he believed about what the frontier would permit a man to feel. Summer brought drought and tension to the territory. Water holes dried up, forcing ranchers to drive cattle further for drinking. Range disputes erupted into violence, and whispers of rustlers operating near Cottonwood Springs put everyone on edge. Xavier rode patrol along Crescent's northern boundary, alert for signs of trouble. The position kept him close to the ranch house, close to Ruby and Tommy, which he told himself was merely convenient. Returning at dusk, Xavier found Tommy sitting alone on the bunkhouse steps, unusual fear etched on his small face. What's wrong, partner? Xavier dismounted quickly. Ma's arguing with a man? Tommy whispered. She told me to wait here. Xavier's hand instinctively dropped to his gun. What man? Don't know. He's fancy. called Ma by a different name. Unease prickled along Xavier's spine as he strode toward the ranch house. Through the kitchen window, he saw Ruby backed against the wall, facing a well-dressed stranger whose stance radiated menace. "Don't care what you call yourself now," the man was saying as Xavier entered. "You're still legally my wife, Rebecca." Ruby's face was pale, but her voice remained steady. "The marriage was never legal, Victor. You already had a wife in St. Louis." The man, Victor, moved closer to Ruby. "A misunderstanding easily rectified now that she's dead. You'll return with me immediately." "The lady isn't going anywhere," Xavier said, his voice deadly quiet. Victor turned, his hand moving toward his coat pocket. "This doesn't concern you, cowboy." Xavier drew his revolver with lightning speed. "Your hand stays where I can see it. Do you know who I am?" Victor's cultured voice couldn't disguise his fury. "Victor Holloway, railroad investor. I own half the territory. And I'm the man who'll put a bullet in you if you don't back away from Miss Calloway," Xavier replied evenly. Ruby moved to Xavier's side. "He's Tommy's father," she whispered. "He abandoned us before Tommy was born. Now he wants an heir." Understanding dawned on Xavier. The lie about Daniel, Ruby's fear, Tommy's resemblance to someone else. Victor Holloway represented everything Xavier despised. Men who used power to take what they wanted without regard for those they hurt. "Miss Calloway and her son are under my protection," Xavier stated. Victor's laugh was cold. "Protection? From a saddle tramp?" His gaze shifted to Ruby. "One telegram to the territorial judge, and I'll have legal custody of my son. The law favors fathers, especially wealthy ones." The truth in his words hung heavy in the air. Ruby's hand found Xavier's arm, trembling slightly. "You have 24 hours to reconsider," Victor said, moving toward the door. "After that, I'll return with the law." When he was gone, Ruby sank into a chair, her face ashen. "He'll take Tommy," she whispered. "Everything I've done to protect him." Xavier knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "We'll leave tonight. I know places in the mountains where no one could find you. And live as fugitives? That's no life for Tommy." "Then marry me," Xavier said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Ruby's eyes widened. "What?" "As your husband, I'd have legal standing to protect you both." Xavier spoke faster, the plan forming as he voiced it. Victor's claim would be weakened if Tommy had a stepfather providing a stable home. "A marriage of convenience," Ruby said softly. Xavier nodded, ignoring the hollow feeling her words created. "It would give us time to fight his claim properly." Ruby studied his face for what felt like eternity. "You would do that for us?" "You saved my son," Xavier whispered, echoing Tommy's words about the rescue. "Now let me spend my life saving you." Something shifted in Ruby's expression, surprise, followed by a tenderness that made Xavier look away, uncomfortable with the feelings it stirred. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you. By moonlight." With only the ranch hands and Ruby's sister as witnesses, Xavier and Ruby exchanged vows before the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through town. Tommy stood proudly between them, his small hand clasping both of theirs as they spoke the words that bound them legally, if not emotionally. Yet as Xavier slipped a simple gold band onto Ruby's finger, his mother's ring, the only keepsake he'd carried through years of drifting, he found himself wishing for something he'd never allowed himself to want. A true marriage, a family, a home that meant more than shelter from the elements. "They're coming," the ranch hand announced, dust still settling around his horse. "Holloway's got the sheriff and 3 deputies with him." Xavier nodded grimly, checking his revolver one last time. 3 days of marriage had changed little between him and Ruby outwardly, but inwardly, Xavier fought a war between the instinct for self-preservation and the growing need to protect what was unexpectedly becoming precious to him. Ruby appeared in the doorway, Tommy clutched to her side. "We could still run," she suggested, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Xavier shook his head. "Running confirms his accusations. We stand our ground as a family." The word hung between them, unfamiliar yet right. Ruby crossed to Xavier's side, arranging herself so they presented a united front as the riders approached. Victor Holloway dismounted first, his expensive suit incongruous against the dusty ranch yard. Sheriff Tucker followed, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Holloway," Victor began. "Mrs. Raines," Xavier corrected coldly. Victor's eyes narrowed on Ruby's wedding band. A convenient arrangement, no doubt. Sheriff, Xavier addressed the lawman directly. My wife and I would like to know why you're trespassing on Crescent Ranch property. Sheriff Tucker cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway has filed papers claiming to be the boy's father and alleging that that the boy's mother is unfit. His mother is my wife, Xavier stated firmly. Any claim against her is a claim against me. The marriage doesn't erase prior rights, Victor interjected smoothly. I can prove paternity. Can you prove you didn't abandon them? Xavier challenged. Can you prove you didn't already have a wife when you seduced a 19-year-old girl? Victor's facade cracked slightly. Careful, Cowboy. Slander is a serious charge. So is bigamy. Ruby spoke up, her voice stronger than Xavier had ever heard it. I have letters, Victor. Letters where you acknowledge your marriage to Elizabeth while promising to marry me. Letters discussing how to hide your unfortunate mistake when you learned I was expecting. Color drained from Victor's face. You're bluffing. My sister has them in town, Ruby continued. One telegraph to the railroad board would raise interesting questions about your character. Sheriff Tucker shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Holloway, you didn't mention any complications. She's lying, Victor snarled, advancing toward Ruby. Xavier stepped between them, hand hovering near his gun. That's close enough. For a tense moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then Victor straightened his jacket, his expression hardening into cold calculation. This isn't over, he promised. No ranch hand can provide what I can for my son. When your situation inevitably deteriorates, I'll be waiting. His gaze moved to Tommy, who clutched Ruby's skirts. Remember what I said, boy? Your place is with me, not these people. As Victor and his entourage departed, Xavier realized Tommy was trembling. He knelt beside the boy, unsure how to offer comfort. He can't take you, Xavier promised. I won't let him. Tommy's small arms wrapped suddenly around Xavier's neck, his face pressing into Xavier's shoulder. The trust in that embrace shook something loose inside Xavier, a dam breaking, flooding him with emotions he'd never allowed himself to feel. Over Tommy's head, his eyes met Ruby's. Her expression mirrored the terrifying realization dawning within him. This arrangement, begun as protection, had somehow become essential to his existence. I should move back to the bunkhouse, Xavier said that night, standing awkwardly by the door of the small cabin they'd been sharing. The single room featured a curtain dividing the sleeping areas, Ruby and Tommy on one side, Xavier on the other. The arrangement preserved propriety while maintaining their appearance as a family. Ruby looked up from where she was tucking Tommy into bed. Why? Victor's gone for now. The immediate danger has passed. Ruby studied him in the lamplight. And if he returns? We maintain this charade only when threatened. The word charade stung more than Xavier expected. I thought you'd want your privacy restored. What I want, Ruby said carefully, is to understand why you're suddenly eager to distance yourself from us. Xavier couldn't articulate the truth, that each day living beside her made the pretense more painful. Watching her brush her hair each night, hearing her hum softly to Tommy, sharing simple meals at their small table, these domestic moments were constructing a vision of what he could never truly have. It's better this way, he said finally. Ruby approached him slowly. Better for whom? Ruby, when you held Tommy today, she interrupted. When you promised to protect him, was that part of our arrangement, or something more? Xavier swallowed hard. He's a good boy. And what am I? Ruby asked, her voice barely audible. A responsibility? An obligation you took on. You know why I married you. I thought I did. Her eyes searched his face. Now I wonder if we both might have had reasons we weren't ready to speak aloud. She was too close, close enough that Xavier could smell the lavender soap in her hair. Ruby, I'm not the man you need. My life has been violence and survival. I don't know how to be anything else. Perhaps, Ruby said softly. That's because no one has ever given you the chance to try. Before Xavier could respond, Ruby closed the distance between them, pressing her lips gently against his. The kiss was brief, tentative, but it shattered the careful boundaries Xavier had constructed. When she pulled back, vulnerability flickered across her face. Tell me to stop, she whispered. Xavier knew he should. Instead, he drew her back to him, his lips finding hers with a hunger that surprised them both. Ruby responded with equal fervor, her body melting against his as years of loneliness burned away in the heat of their embrace. Later, as they lay together in the narrow bed, Ruby's head resting on his chest, Xavier confronted the terrifying truth. He was falling in love with his wife. The realization brought not joy but fear. Fear that having found something worth living for, he would inevitably lose it, as he had lost everyone who had ever mattered. Summer faded into autumn, bringing cattle drives, early frosts, and an uneasy peace. Xavier's marriage, begun as protection, deepened into something neither he nor Ruby had anticipated. Tommy called him Pa, now, a name Xavier treasured even as he feared its impermanence. The Holloway threat still hangs over us, Xavier reminded Ruby one night as they sat on their small porch, watching Tommy chase fireflies. He's a patient man. He'll wait until we're vulnerable. Ruby laced her fingers through his. Then we won't be vulnerable. Jim's offered you the foreman position when Peterson retires this winter. A permanent position, Xavier mused, the concept both appealing and terrifying. A future, Ruby corrected. For all of us. Xavier wanted to believe it possible, that the frontier that had taken everything from him might finally give something back. Yet the shadow of his past loomed large, a truth he still hadn't shared with Ruby. That truth found them sooner than Xavier feared. He returned from checking fence lines one evening to find a stranger waiting at the ranch house, a face he'd hoped never to see again. Marshal Davis. Xavier greeted coldly, dismounting and positioning himself between the lawman and his home. Raines. The federal marshal's weathered face revealed nothing. Or should I say Cross? Xavier Cross, wanted in 3 territories. Xavier's stomach dropped. That man died years ago. Tell that to the Colton family. They still want justice for their boy. It was self-defense, Xavier said quietly, aware of movement at the cabin door. Ruby, listening. Maybe so, Marshall conceded. But you ran. Running makes you look guilty. I was 19, facing a hanging posse stirred up by the Coltons. What would you have done? The marshal studied him. I'm not here to debate old history. I'm here because someone filed an interesting report. Claimed Xavier Raines is harboring a woman and child under false pretenses. Victor Holloway. The realization hit Xavier like a physical blow. My wife and son are none of your concern. They become my concern when I discover you're a wanted man living under an alias. The marshal's hand rested casually near his gun. Makes me wonder what else might be false. Ruby appeared beside Xavier, her face pale but composed. Our marriage is legal and binding, Marshal. I have the certificate. A marriage based on deception isn't something the courts look kindly upon, ma'am. The marshal's gaze softened slightly, especially when children are involved. Xavier felt his world collapsing around him. Everything he feared was coming to pass, his past destroying the future he'd dared to want. Give me tonight, Xavier said finally, to explain to my family. The marshal nodded. Dawn tomorrow, Raines or Cross. We ride for the territorial court. What happens after that depends on whether the Coltons still want blood or can be satisfied with justice. After the marshal departed, Xavier stood frozen, unable to face Ruby. When he finally turned, the betrayal in her eyes cut deeper than any bullet. Xavier Cross, she whispered. Who are you? Xavier told her everything. The drunken confrontation in a saloon, the knife that appeared in his hand just as Jonathan Colton charged him, the blood spreading across the barroom floor. How he'd fled in the night, changed his name, spent years looking over his shoulder. I killed a man, he finished, his voice hollow. Not in a fair fight. In a brawl I was too young and stupid to avoid. Ruby had listened in silence, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. All this time, she began, then stopped. Our entire marriage is built on a lie. Not everything was a lie, Xavier protested. What I feel for you and Tommy. Stop. Ruby held up her hand. Don't say things now that you never said before danger forced your hand. Her words struck like a physical blow. Ruby, please, you're leaving with the marshal tomorrow? Xavier nodded grimly. If I run, he'll never stop hunting me. And Victor will use my fugitive status to strengthen his claim on Tommy. So once again, we lose someone Ruby's voice broke. Someone we counted on. The resignation in her tone devastated Xavier more than anger would have. She had expected to be abandoned again, and he had proven her right. That night, Xavier slept on the porch, giving Ruby space he assumed she needed. In the cold hours before dawn, he crept inside to gather his few possessions. To his surprise, Ruby sat waiting, a small leather bundle in her hands. "These are the letters," she said quietly. "The ones that prove Victor's bigamy. Take them with you." Xavier hesitated. "They're your protection, and now they're yours." Ruby's eyes glistened in the darkness. Evidence that Victor Holloway is not a man fit to raise any child. Understanding dawned slowly. "You're giving me a way to fight back." "I'm giving you a reason to return," Ruby corrected. "If you want to." Xavier knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Ruby, I have never wanted anything more than to return to you and Tommy. But I need you to know the truth before you decide if that's what you want." "What truth?" "That I love you," Xavier said simply. "Not because you needed saving or because I felt responsible. Because you made me believe that even someone like me could find a home." Ruby's tears fell freely now. "Then come home to us, Xavier. Whatever name you carry, whatever verdict the court delivers, just come home." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Xavier kissed his wife and son goodbye. The marshal waited outside, patient but firm. With Ruby's letters secured inside his shirt, close to his heart, Xavier mounted Thunder and rode toward a reckoning long overdue, carrying with him a purpose more powerful than fear, the need to return to the family that had given meaning to his existence. 3 months later, as winter's grip began to loosen, Ruby stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching Tommy build a snow fort. Her hands rested on her slightly rounded belly, a secret joy she'd discovered only after Xavier's departure, a promise of future she prayed they would share. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A lone rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Though the figure was too distant to identify, Ruby knew with inexplicable certainty who it was. "Tommy," she called, her voice trembling. "Look who's coming." The boy scrambled to his feet, shielding his eyes against the glare. When recognition dawned, he let out a whoop of joy and began running toward the approaching rider. Xavier dismounted just in time to catch Tommy as the boy launched himself forward. Swinging the child into his arms, Xavier held him tight, his eyes finding Ruby over Tommy's shoulder. They stood frozen for a moment, separated by 50 yards and 3 months of uncertainty. Then Xavier set Tommy down and walked toward her, his steps quickening as he drew closer. Ruby didn't realize she was moving until they met in the middle, her arms wrapping around his neck as it circled her waist. He lifted her off her feet, burying his face in her hair. "You're free?" she whispered against his neck. "Cleared of all charges," Xavier confirmed. The Colton boy's friend finally came forward, admitted Jonathan drew first. Ruby pulled back, searching his face. "And Victor?" A slow smile spread across Xavier's features. "Currently explaining to railroad investors why he committed fraud and bigamy. Your letters were quite convincing, Mrs. Raines." "Cross," Ruby corrected softly. "If that's the name you want to reclaim." Xavier shook his head. "Xavier Raines is the man who found you and Tommy. He's the man who discovered what truly matters. That's who I want to be." As he set her down, his hand brushed against the gentle swell of her belly. Xavier went completely still, his eyes widening in wonder. "I was going to tell you," Ruby began, but then the marshal came, and Xavier silenced her with a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never believed in second chances," he murmured. "The frontier taught me that life takes more than it gives. But you and Tommy, and now this little one, you've given me something I never thought possible." "What's that?" Ruby asked, though she could see the answer shining in his eyes. "A future worth fighting for," Xavier replied. "A family worth coming home to." He glanced at Tommy, who watched them with unabashed joy. "A son who saved me long before I saved him." As they walked hand in hand toward their cabin, the setting sun cast long shadows across the land, a frontier that had once seemed barren to Xavier, but now represented possibility. The harsh lessons of survival that had shaped him were not erased but transformed, tempered by the greater strength he had discovered in vulnerability, in connection, in love. The West had indeed taken much from Xavier Cross, but in giving him Ruby and Tommy Raines, it had returned to him something far more precious, a heart he'd thought long lost, and the courage to trust it to others.